Greetings and welcome to the Father Sebastiaan Experience. Vampires, magic, music, and the paranormal. Please allow me to introduce myself. I'm Father Sebastiaan, Impresario of the Endless Night Vampire Ball and Master Fangsmith of the Sabretooth Clan. Welcome, friends. And today I'd like to welcome our new guest of our first episode, Rose Sinister from Rose Sinister Podcast.
Hello. So good to be here.
I love your background.
Oh, thank you. This is my office. This is my bookshelf. I'm surrounded by the accoutrements of my trade, which is basically if it has a vampire in it, I have a copy of it, and then I pick it apart academically and take all the joy out of it, which fills me with tremendous joy.
Wait, so you've heard of me before?
I've heard of you. One might say your reputation precedes you.
Ooh, okay. Well, we have a lot to talk about today, so let's relax and enjoy the conversation.
Sure.
I'm glad to hear you're fully settled in Florida, but not giving up in New Orleans.
Oh no, never. The entire plan when we relocated to New Orleans, it was for my beloved husband, job of a lifetime, career opportunity. I support him, but where we chose to live is also accessible to New Orleans so that I can continue to maintain my career as a tour guide, which is something that I find enjoyable, and it makes life worth living. I love my work.
I was a tour guide in Paris for 8 years and New York for 3.
Yeah.
Okay. I want to see you do tours all over the world, but do you think you'll ever expand outside of New Orleans?
I think so. At one point, I was in discussions with a former colleague of mine who was Romanian, and we had planned to do a couple of week-long excursions in Romania, doing vampire-themed tours in Romania that were geared towards a much more academic, serious-minded tourist rather than the shock value, kitschy sort of Dracula tourism that a lot of the vampire tours in Romania currently are. We were planning on, going to a monastery garden and talking about different herbs that had folklore properties, and going to a distillery and talking about the significance of various distilled spirits, and how the consumption of various distilled spirits may have played a role in the development of certain folklore over the years. And we had all of these plans.
Are you talking like Scooby snacks?
Scooby snacks, somewhat.
Okay.
The pandemic sort of put a stop on that, so I don't know if we're going to do the Romanian tour, but I would love to do a Rose Sinister Whitby England tour. I would love to do a Rose Sinister Romania tour. I would love to do travel themed tours, but that's something that's kind of we're laying the foundations of. Maybe, hopefully, cross your fingers.
Well, if Europe opens up, we'll see.
Everything's going to open up eventually. We're going to find a new normal. It's just going to take a while to adjust, and then we will adjust and we will make the necessary accommodations, and life will go on because we're human beings and we're imminently adaptable.
Now, we've had many conversations about various subjects over the years that we've known each other.
Yes.
Over paninis, over many food tables, over tables at restaurants, at people's homes. We've had late night conversations while we're sitting on the couch waiting for a vampire ball to happen. We've actually been able to do tours in New Orleans in the middle of a pandemic.
That was fun.
We had Halloween on a Saturday night with a full moon with an extra witching hour with 12 people in the House of Blues.
That was an extraordinary evening.
What was the most memorable experience that you've had with us together?
I would say one of my most memorable experiences was walking around Los Angeles with you and talking about vampires. We did a podcast before. We tried to do that before, but you were going around to different Fang appointments, and we were just walking around LA and talking about vampires. And I remember that the weather was just so beautiful, and I remember that the bougainvillea and the roses and the morning glories were in bloom, and I remember the peculiar quality of the sky, and I remember thinking, good friends and good conversations and beautiful weather You can't get better than that. Never
Southern California
experience.
Isn't Southern California paradise?
Well, I don't know that it's my paradise anymore, but it's a lovely place to visit.
I'm talking about the weather.
The weather's nice. The weather's nice. I grew up in the San Fernando Valley back in the late 19th century, or late 1900s rather. I grew up in the San Fernando Valley in the late 1900s, as the kids say now on TikTok. And I remember it was just smoggy and muggy, and you could never see the mountains. So the air quality in Los Angeles has improved enormously since I left. But my memories of Los Angeles do not include perfect weather. My memories of Los Angeles have a lot of wheezing trying to get across the schoolyard.
Well, you know what we forgot to do? We forgot to ask about your podcast. And let's get back to it. So, Rose, tell us about your adventures in the vampire world. Your vampire...
In the vampire world, I have been a fan of vampire media since I was a very small child. The story is I discovered a copy of Interview with the Vampire that had been left behind at my house by a babysitter. I hid the book from my very religious parents. I read the book. I was terrified of vampires. Revisited the same book a few years later in my late teens and had a very different experience with the material. And that began my sort of academic interest in vampires, because I started college and I was an anthropology major, and I realized that I could study folklore and myth and legend and how that related to vampire stories, and how the folklore became the fiction, became the metaphor, became the metonym that we know as the modern vampire mythos now. And so I've been involved in that sort of dissection and discussion of vampire stories for my entire adult life. When I moved to New Orleans, I started working as a vampire tour guide. It was a very obvious choice of career for me, and I did quite well at it. And then people said, well, why don't you have a podcast? And I said, I don't know. Why don't I have a podcast? So in 2018, I started a podcast. And it was a very different kind of podcast, not like the one that we're doing right now, where it's two people having a conversation about a variety of different things. My podcast is narrated. It is an audio essay, and every 2 weeks or so I drop a new one, and I take a piece of vampire media and I dissect it. I skewer it from every angle, and we talk about why these stories matter.
Why do they matter?
Because vampires are us. We are vampires.
We suck.
The human experience, especially the human experience in the modern era, the human experience of the 20th and the 21st century, is one of obligatory consumption. We are as conflicted over our need of petroleum and fast fashion and food that's carted in from long distances. And all of these things are very, very destructive. They're very damaging, and yet our very life and our very existence sort of depends on it. Vampire stories, one of their functions is to sort of ease us into conversations about how we are the predators of the natural world, and what does that mean, and what is our responsibility to our environments.
Whoa. Okay.
Like, I skewer this stuff from every angle. I'm sorry.
I know you do, and that's why we're talking. And one of the things that really appreciated, because I'm into the more the metaphysical and expressing the folklore, and you're more into the scholarly thing. And what I love about the vampire community is we have different types of people in the VC.
Yes.
Okay. And vampire culture, and I call the great vampire current the current, or it's like a river that flows of mythology and legend, and everybody that's tied to the vampire current is has a passion and a love for it in various ways.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that there's people that identify as vampires, people that love to dress up as vampires, people that love to be scholars, people that like to role play, people like to use the magical thing. It's like, I remember one of my colleagues told me that in the 90s, we were just in the womb, in the 80s and 90s and early 90s in the womb, and then it exploded in 1995.
Yeah.
And that was the catalyst year. That's when I had my most incredible experience. But that's when the Memnock ball happened.
The infamous New Orleans Memnock Ball, right after Interview with the Vampire had been released. It was not an event that I was able to attend, but I've grown up in the shadow of its legacy and its stories.
It was an incredible weekend. What was weird, it was on a Friday night.
The Anne Rice Vampire Lestat Fan Club Ball is always on the Friday before Halloween.
I know. I just never figured that out.
Sorry.
I was always curious because I remember before the Thursday night before and the Saturday night after, people were renting mansions and like there was 100 parties going on before and after.
Yeah, those sort of things you could do back in the day before the housing market completely exploded.
Well, let's hope the pandemic fixes that.
Yeah, it'll even out. Things always do eventually. There's a balance. There's a balance that is always arrived at, I think, sooner rather than later. I love the various experiences people have with the vampire current. I love talking with sanguinarian vampires, and I love talking with the role players, and I love talking with people who are cosplayers, and I love talking to people who are lifestylers, and I am to varying degrees many of those things myself. I am just predominantly a scholar, but my interests in the vampire current run very, very deep.
You know what's interesting is the diversity of people in the VC.
Yes.
Okay, and now I like to also make something very clear. VC doesn't mean just vampire community. It means vampire current. It means vampire culture. It should be VCCCC. A lot of people focus on the community, but the thing is that the vampire can be done as a solitary experience, and it predominantly is.
I think it's connected by the media, the meta narrative, the story, and how people relate to that story. That's the predominant thread of the current. That's the electrified core of the current, is the stories that have been told and the stories that we tell, and that can be done individually or collectively. And I love the variety that vampire stories sort of engender.
And I also like that the vampire can be anything. It can be sci-fi, it can be mythological, it can be fantasy, it can be Christian, like Dracula with the Christian curse. It can be, like movie Life Force, one of my favorite movies.
I've read somewhere that the vampire is the potato of pop culture folklore. Because you can do anything with it. You can do anything with it, and you can satisfy almost any appetite, just depending on the way that you prepare it.
What's your favorite vampire movie?
Oh, my favorite vampire movie is Only Lovers Left Alive. It's about as good as you can get for me.
It reminds me a lot of the tone of, like a weird tone of The Hunger. It's kind of like close to that in a lot of ways, but completely different.
Well, I think the relationship between the characters, the fact that it is The Hunger is in part the love affair between these two characters who have been in love for a very, very long time, and as he starts to fade away, what she is doing to cope with the inevitability of his loss. In Only Lovers Left Alive, you have a similar dynamic where these two individuals who happen to be vampires have been in love for a very long time, but there is no inevitability to Adam's loss or destruction, and Eve is trying to sort of hold him back from crumbling into the abyss. And so in many ways, it mirrors The Hunger, but it also sort of redeems the central tragedy of The Hunger, because at the end of the film, Adam and Eve are still together, and in The Hunger, John and Miriam Laylock, they do not have a happy ending.
That's true. You know, one of the things that each vampire movie has contributed something unique, like to the vampire current. Like, for example, The Hunger contributed the Ankh, okay, the bladed Ankh.
I have one of those. I was going to wear it, but I couldn't find it.
Well, I remember when I was a kid, obviously the Hunger Onk inspired the Legacy Onk.
Mhm.
Uh, but what was great was I first saw that Onk. I was in 1993. I walked into a shop in Manhattan on 9th Street and 2nd Avenue called Skin Crawl. And they had, by a guy named Joe Netherworld, two vampire artifacts. They had a X-Acto knife in a Hunger Onk about this big. Okay, and it had leather twine around it. It was so beautiful, and I was like, "Wow!" I haven't seen one since. And then they had the thumb claw from Interview with the Vampire.
Oh, I love that thumb claw.
So, but here's the weird part. That thumb claw, the movie. When did Interview with the Vampire come out?
November 1994.
Okay, that's why the Memnock ball was so big, because it was a year after the ball came out.
Right
After
on
the
the heels of its success.
So the thumb claw, like the vampire artifact, that um cross, that Ankh, was huge. And then I saw an artist in Seattle made a version, which I think you might have a version of that one. It's a little smaller. It's about this big. Doesn't have an X-Acto knife blade.
No, it has a much duller blade. And if I wanted to draw blood with it, I would have to use quite a bit of force and poke, poke, poke.
Or say to your donor, close your eyes, and then like unsheath it, and then pull out a lancelet and like poke them, and then like put it back. Did I just talk about sanguine?
I think you did. I think you implied that I was, which I have never actually confirmed or denied, and I will not now either.
I will never confirm or deny that I told everybody about it.
You didn't tell anybody.
I told, not about you, but about my
Oh.
things. I mean, legally, we can't have that at our events. It's takeout only. Sorry. I mean, it's you got to bring your food home, and you know. But the thing is that let's talk about that later.
Yeah.
And see what the fascination, because there's some such. Well, let's talk about it now, I guess. What percentage of the vampire community do you think actually drinks blood?
A very small percentage. A very small percentage. However, what percentage of vampire fans do I think have consumed blood? Because those are two very different things, right?
Yeah.
The experimentation in the past versus the ongoing consumption. I think those who pursue it ongoing are a very, very small percentage of the vampire community. I think those who have dabbled in the red stuff recreationally or in kink encounters with their partners, I think that number is very high. I don't think there's any statistics on that, but I think that number is very high.
When I got into the VC back in 1992, okay, there was basically the Temple of the Vampire and role playing games, and that was it. And the Order of the Vampire from the Temple of Set.
Fan clubs and fan conventions and like newsletters and things of that nature, but there wasn't a lot.
But what I'm getting to is that the Order of the Vampire from the Temple of Set in 1984 and the Temple of the Vampire are hardcore anti-blood drinking. And a lot of people would go there and expect to be able to find donors or other people that knew what to do, and they didn't find it. So people were going to go and do it no matter what. So they went out and they did it. And there was a couple resources for people to do it, but I agree. I don't think the majority of the vampire community does that, and I agree that people experimented with it.
Well, I mean, look at the broader historical context and what else was going on culturally in the early mid-90s. You had the AIDS epidemic and how that is a blood and bodily fluid borne disease, and that was terrifying. That eliminated an entire generation of LGBTQ plus individuals, and it terrified an entire generation of otherwise straight individuals off of, you know, the dangers of sex. The fear of blood was also part of what drove the taboo. And just as there was an emphasis in the 90s on harm reduction and, you know, safer sex, or even you started to see movements towards harm reduction with like needle exchanges and stuff, I do think that there was a need for information about sanguinarianism for those who were going to do it. This is the information that you need to not harm yourself or others. That's harm reduction. And that's very much part of the broader cultural paradigm of the early mid-90s as well. I mean, that makes sense. You have the abstinence only groups, and then you have the ones who say, if you're going to do it safe. And I think there's a space for both of those voices.
I agree. And, you know, being in the club scene in the 90s, I got into Limelight in 1993, 94, and what I saw there would not fly today. Like, by far. Like, walking in there and the things that I saw and the experiences that I've not personally had. I was an observer, more of a voyeur. Okay, the whole Michael Alec and Club Kid thing. All right, and then down, that was in 23rd and 8th Avenue, or 6th Avenue. Then you go down to the Meatpacking District, which is basically 14th Street. And I'll tell you, there was some serious shit going on down there. Excuse my French. Tell our producer I'm sorry. I cursed.
We can bleep that out.
Oh, good. So the Meatpacking District had two nightclubs that were fetish clubs that used to have bloodletting going on. And vampires in the 80s were they weren't organized. They were in the BDSM community because the Gothic community rejected them wholeheartedly.
I remember that old alt.gothic convergence joke about, you know, don't take your fangs to convergence. Oh, it's the next room over. There definitely was animosity between the goth community and the vampire community back in the 90s. I think the lines have been blurred quite a bit since.
I think the goths, like, I remember being in a supermarket and a goth was sitting there like Sisters of Mercy with his hair up. I mean, in South Park, they kind of described the animosity between the goths and the vampires in the episode The Ungroundable, where Butters becomes a vampire.
One of my favorite episodes. Love it.
They did their research. The clamato juice is real.
We're down the hot topic.
But what was really interesting is that these two clubs, okay, where the people that I looked up to went as elders, the BDSM community, because the Gothic community rejected the vampires. Like, I mean, it was to a point of abuse. The Goths were that, like, high school abusive.
Interesting antagonism is something that you're always going to find in communities of alternative individuals, though, because everybody's trying to assert their dominance as the penultimate alternative current, archetype.
Mm-hmm. Well, I remember this goth standing in the supermarket, and this little kid goes up, and he was wearing sunglasses and a black button-up shirt, had his hair done up just to go to the supermarket, as some goths do. And he was wearing pointy shoes with buckles, and he had black fingernails. And it was I believe on Avenue A in New York, near the bank, which was the big goth club. And little kid pulls on her mom's thing. She goes, Mommy, look at the vampire. And I was dressed in plain clothes. I looked more like a light metalhead light. And this guy took his sunglasses down, and he looked down at the kid, and he goes, I'm not a vampire. I'm a Get the two straight. one is dead, one is undead. And he put his glasses up, and he paid his bill, and he walked away in a British strut. And he was British. And then I remember going up to Boston in 1995 when I was just, because that was the first year I was making fangs. And I met this guy named Kurzak, and I said, "Can I make fangs in your club?" And he said, "We already had a Fangsmith, fang maker, because there was the word Fangsmith didn't come around until 98. And he goes, "I will not tolerate blood drinking or thinking that you're 500 years old in my club. Oh, and by the way, walk out in the sun tomorrow." And I was like, "What are you talking about? I just want to make fangs." And he's like, "Let me make it straight. We're goths here. We're not vampires." And then I went to the Memnock ball and everything changed. I was in my element.
I think there's, also going back to what some of the culture at the time was. Let's not forget that the 90s were also still very much part of the satanic panic and the fear about, satanic sex cults. We're seeing a resurgence of that now in online conspiracy theory circles, but very real fear of child predatory satanic sex cults that drank blood. Okay, the more things change, the more things stay the same. But that was something that was being exploited by daytime talk show hosts, by AM radio talk show hosts, by really exploitative op-eds in newspapers. And so you already had the normies looking down on people who identified as goth or alternative as aberrant, as dangerous, and distancing themselves from the vampire community was a way of, it was an unfortunate attempt at self-preservation, rather than realizing that like we have more in common. We are more alike than we are unalike. It was really, it came from this gut powerful sort of a knee-jerk revulsion to say, that's not me. I'm not weird like that. I'm weird like this. My weirdness is much more palatable. It's much more, family friendly to middle America. Just, I just dress weird. So I think that's also, part of it. Things
that
don't
is
happen in vacuums.
That's a remarkable analysis from an anthropological mind as yours, as good as yours. I never thought of that.
I mean, that's the sort of stuff that my podcast is all about. An episode that I'm working on right now is I would say it's practically criminally underseen George A. Romero's Martin, which was filmed in 1976. It was released in 77 or 78. And it's a film that sort of blurs the line between, clinical vampirism and folklore vampirism. There's this is he or isn't he sort of a theme that runs through it. But what Martin is he is a serial killer and a violent sexual assaulter. And, he kills people to drink their blood, and he honestly believes that he needs it. And, that was sort of this media understanding of like who and what a vampire is. And then you have Richard Knoll, Dr. Richard Knoll. He was a clinical psychiatrist who invented Renfield syndrome. Really, it was a spoof. It was a parody of the DSM psychology speak. But it really took off with people saying Renfield syndrome, this is a thing that you can have. And children, they start drinking blood when they're young, and then they have a sexual attraction to it, and then they go off and they kill people. And that's just not true. But I mean, that was that was something that really was grabbed by armchair pop psychiatrists and pop psychologists, and that was something that people were very much afraid of.
It was interesting. I read in a book by a friend of mine named Don Webb, who is the high priest of the Temple of Set from 1998 to 2002. He's releasing a book on May 4th this year. And what is incredible is he told me how Anton LaVey, the founder of the Church of Satan, got through the satanic panic without any trouble.
Hmm.
He
What was
made
the secret?
his secret was he was campy and sideshow carnival. Okay. He had a pitchfork and devil's horns and a naked woman. And he said, Satan is not real. I'm just pretending to be a Satanist so I can get away with being an atheist. And he didn't get touched.
I guarantee you, as somebody who grew up in Christian evangelical circles, they definitely believed that he was in league with Lucifer.
Really?
Oh, absolutely.
Wow. Okay.
Oh, absolutely. I sat in chapels in the mid-90s listening to my Baptist youth pastor go on about how Anton LaVey was a literal tool of Satan.
Wow.
Yeah,
well,
and that was in Southern California, liberal Los Angeles, but I can only imagine how much worse his reputation was in, much more staunchly conservative parts of the Bible Belt.
Maybe they didn't talk about him because they were scared of him.
Possibly. I think, he didn't get touched in the way that, like, no one was able to pin him, to connect him to any murders. No one was ever able to accuse him of being the leader of a blood sex cult that made people go out and kill. He never, there was never anything to tie him to any, Charles Manson style massacres. Although, I guarantee you there were small town prosecutors in the southern states that would have loved nothing more than to pull Anton LaVey over for a routine traffic stop and find something to charge him with.
Like marijuana?
Look at the West Memphis 3. Going back to like the Satanic Panic, and that does tie into fears of ritualized satanic blood drinking. That was very prominent on the talk show circuit in the 90s. And that's why the Goths wanted to separate themselves so much from it. That's why there was so much pushback within the Goth scene. And that's why the vampire community was sort of embraced by the BDSM scene, because, well, bloodletting is just another kink. It's a much more extreme kink. We're all kinksters here. Then join us in our kinky fun. That all makes sense to me.
That is a very, very good analysis. Thank you for sharing that. That was a good way to see it from an anthropological perspective.
Sociological, really, I think.
Okay, very good. One of the things there was two clubs called the Vault and the Hellfire Club in New York, and they were originally the same club called the Vault, and the Hellfire Club obviously is named after the Hellfire Club of the old days. But the thing is, they had a big sign on the door: "No blood drinking. Fangs welcome." And that was up for a couple of weeks because my Fang clients were in the BDSM community.
But I think now you don't have to be part of the BDSM community. You don't even have to identify as a kinkster to want fangs, to wear fangs, to incorporate those visuals as part of your identity stylistically. And I think that again shows that there's been this cultural shift away from kink, and now fangs are like a fashion accessory.
Yeah, like on TikTok.
Absolutely. Fangs are just another way to ornament yourself.
Just like a collar with a ring on it is just a fashion statement.
I think a lot of people use it because it's a way to like embrace their more primitive side, their animalistic side. People are trying to get in touch with that side of themselves. I think that's probably a driving force behind a lot of your Fang clients today. Fangs mean something different to people who wear them today than I think they did 20 years ago or 30 years ago.
I think the type of people that wear fangs is broadened.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
I remember when the vampire community didn't have definitions and there was nothing solidified. There was nothing solid. There was nothing to Um, everything was just like they had
nebulous.
Yes. Thank you for giving me a word. And being an architect of the vampire community has been an interesting experience because I saw the evolution in 1995 of the vampire community from 91 to 95, really in-person meeting at goth clubs, the BDSM clubs, but predominantly in the Vampire the Masquerade role-playing scene. The LARP scene was where a lot of vampires would go to try to kind of find each other, kind of like a gay community would. There's a lot of parallels between the gay community. And in Vampire Magazine, our friend Buck Argos is going to be writing an article for the Pride issue on the history of LGBT and vampires.
I'm looking forward to that quite a bit.
Yeah. I mean, I prefer, as a bisexual myself, I prefer to use the term queer. It's just less complex. But LGBTQ plus is pretty cool.
It's queer is all encompassing, but it's also important to remember the legacy of that word and the way that it was weaponized against that marginalized community for so long, that there are people who have a lot of baggage associated with that word. And I can understand and respect to a certain extent why somebody would prefer not to use it. But I also think that policing labels is not a good look. The whole queer is a slur crowd can suck my hangnails.
Well, they can suck my hangnails too because I'm queer as shit.
Yeah.
And I'm proud and happy to be queer, but LGBTQ it just reminds me of like IHOP. All right. It's like an
Alphabet
acronym.
Mafia.
Yeah, and Alphabet Super. Alphabet's the cereal. Lucky Charms I think has alphabets in it. But the thing is that
lexicons are always shifting.
Yeah, of course. Like the word they always meant neutral gender, okay, or non-binary, but it hasn't been in use, and the common conception has been that it has been when I was writing my books back in the 90s, I used they because I didn't want to be gender biased.
Right.
I wanted to be more encompassing because I didn't think that he was a good default. I wish English had something like German, die, das, where there was a neutral.
Well, they has been used as a gender neutral singular going all the way back to the Canterbury Tales.
I'm cool with that. That's great.
I mean, there are so many documented instances of the singular they as a gender neutral use. It has centuries of history in written and spoken language. Anyone who says that it's some sort of a newfangled thing really doesn't understand the history of the English language very well at all.
Well, I'm glad that we have they. I wish there was, they in my when I wrote they into the Vampire Almanacs back in the 90s, I was using it. I remember using it, and people never really brought it up until the subject came into collective consciousness with the American culture. They being like, what do you mean it's a plural word? Okay, well, plural is male and female. I mean, a male and a female together is more than one. Okay.
I think the idea that they is only plural, that's very, very reactionary. But also let's remember that language changes and English has changed remarkably. English used to have formal and informal pronouns, thou and you, but we've only reserved the you, and which used to be the formal. English used to have gendered nouns the way that German or French or Spanish does, but we don't have gendered nouns anymore. Wow. So I think it's entirely possible and probable that English will continue to evolve, and the use of the singular gender neutral they is just going to become increasingly established as part of our ongoing vernacular shift.
Well, and plus with the internet, things move a lot quicker. With social media, in the 90s we had, what was a good, cool, awesome, were those 90s?
A slang?
Like when they say cool and awesome.
Yeah, what was it? Oh gosh, I don't even remember the 90s slang that I used. Cool, awesome. Rad was really more in the 80s. We'd already lost rad by the 90s. Sweet. Sweet was a big one. Sweet. Yeah. Dude reigns supreme. That's regional though.
You know what's interesting is today, I just launched a program to start a vampire cryptocurrency.
What are you going to call it? Blood bites?
No. Well, we've got a couple working terms. I'll tell you afterwards, because by the time this airs, we won't have it. But
Okay.
I've already got 4 businesses willing to accept it.
Sure. I barely understand cryptocurrency, but I have been informed that this is a thing that exists.
Well, I'm sure it will be awesome and rad to see how sweet this is.
Sweet, dude.
Because let's be frank with each other. Vampires are time travelers. Okay, they're heroes. They're monsters. They're sexy. They're seductive, and they're time travelers. I mean, can't get more than that.
Right. So
let's get back to vampire movies. Okay. Only Lovers Left Alive is your favorite.
What yours again?
The one that strikes me most to my heart is Lost Boys, but Only Lovers Left Alive I really appreciate. But my real secret favorite movie is Vampire in Brooklyn.
Okay.
Because
what is it about that film that just really calls to you? I want to know.
I really like the legend, which I've heard before, but it was the first time in cinema that I heard it, that all the vampires are from Egypt and Africa, and they died out, and the survivors went to Carpathia. Okay, that was pretty cool story, because they started in Mesopotamia and with human civilization, and I love that. I love the comedy. I love Eddie Murphy. Looked freaking awesome.
He did. He's never looked better.
And yeah, and I love the famous line, "Evil is good. Evil is good," and it just, that opening scene where you hear the legends of the vampires, and he comes in, and it made me feel good, because I was living in New York and I was seeing all these Black and Hispanic kids adopt the vampire archetype, and they didn't really have an archetype to work with. And it was really cool to see something I could passionately bridge, communicate with them as a New Yorker. And it wasn't just a role-playing game, and it wasn't a tribal thing. Eddie Murphy was really it wasn't blaxploitation. It was really cool.
I'm absolutely here for vampires of color. I think that Vampire in Brooklyn helped pave the way for Blade. The success of Blade helped pave the way for the entire MCU, and now Blade's going to come back into the MCU. I'm very excited about that. That's going to be an interesting thing. Speaking of, did you see the Netflix film, The Vampires versus the Bronx?
No, I gotta catch it.
Super cute. It's super cute, although it really is more of a vampire hunters movie than a vampires movie. It ties back to the Lost Boys very much. You are rooting for the vampire hunters more than you are rooting for the vampires. But it is a cute movie where the vampires are sort of the vampires are behind gentrification. And it just makes perfect sense. It just makes perfect sense. Blame the vampires for gentrification, and the signage that they built in world for that film, I am quite fond of, and I would love some actual merch from the fake real estate company that was developed for that movie, because I thought that it was just fantastic. The ephemera that they created for that film was really cute.
I think the best made vampire film is a toss-up between Bram Stoker's Dracula and Interview with the Vampire.
The production quality of both of those and the scope of both of them is really something else. Only Lovers Left Alive had that really high production value, but it didn't have the same scope. It's a very intimate movie.
Right.
But what you find with both the 92 Bram Stoker's Dracula and with Interview with the Vampires, you just have this lush, sweeping sort of a centuries-long narrative, and I think that that's very appealing.
And it showed the time traveler element to the vampire.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
The vampire is gonna, in Anne Rice's Vampires, okay. When I read Interview with the Vampire and I read Vampire Lestat and Queen of the Damned, I couldn't get into the ex-vampire novels of Interview with the Vampire Chronicles. Like she lost me at Tale of the Body Thief, which I heard is a great book and I might give it another shot, but like. I find it interesting how Game of Thrones was turned into a TV show, and it was really a great show off a book. I think if done well, the Vampire Chronicles could be.
The Vampire Chronicles television show has been in pre-production for a long time. Anne Rice has been in full control of her IP, her intellectual property, for a while. And Brian Fuller was attached to the project for a while. There have been other showrunners who've been attached to the project. It was going to be on Hulu, and then Disney bought Hulu, and I guess Disney didn't want to make Lestat a Disney princess, so it wasn't on Hulu. I think Showtime was interested in it a while. There have been a lot of bidding wars for this because there is this feel that it could be the next Game of Thrones. If I could voice my personal concerns, I think Anne Rice is her own worst enemy. I think she has a demonstrated tendency to be very controlling of her characters and
like her hostility to fan fiction.
Like her hostility to fan fiction, yes. Or the way that she rejected having editors after Tale of the Body Thief, which is why, honestly, the quality of her writing went way down as the 90s progressed, because she edited all of her stuff herself. You find that there was chronological errors, and you find that there's grammatical errors, things that she didn't catch. She no longer used an in-house publishing editor for her work. Anne Rice has a tendency to self-sabotage. And I'm afraid that what should be her swan song is going to become her postmortem legacy.
Mm-hmm.
She's in very frail and fragile health, and I would hate to see her pass on before she got to see her creations come to life on the television screen. But I just get this feel from the news that I've been consuming that that might be part of the reason.
Is that
it hasn't happened yet?
Is her?
Mm-hmm. We can all be our own worst enemies.
I really. Okay, so we need to get one more question in. Okay. We need to talk about your podcast and what is most important about it.
Sure.
That is.
So my podcast is an examination of vampire stories, one tale at a time, and it is an examination of why these stories matter. What is the folklore that inspired it? How did the story inspire the folklore that came after it? What are the socio-political, cultural conditions that shape the story or shape the experience of the author or the creator in a way that it would be, it would show up in the finished product? And so it is anthropological, it is sociological. I consider myself more of a cultural historian now than an anthropologist. The podcast is available on Podbean, Spotify, Google Play, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and iHeartRadio. So anywhere that you would normally listen to podcasts, you can find Rose Sinister Vampires. I'm also in the process of starting a YouTube channel where the podcast episodes will be turned into more YouTube style video essays, I think, with pictures and captions for the hearing impaired. Are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay. Pictures and captions for the hearing impaired. And then I have a Patreon, Rose Sinister, where people can support me and my ongoing work. And I think that probably within the next couple of episodes, I'm going to start releasing my podcast episodes to Patreon a week to 2 weeks earlier than they come out available to everyone else. So if you want to get the newest episode as soon as it's out, supporting me on Patreon would be a fantastic way to have access to that.
And they can find you at rosesinister.podbean.com.
rosesinister.podbean.com or just rosesinister.com. There are links from that main site to all of my social media, to my podcast, my Facebook page, my TikTok, my YouTube, my Instagram, my Twitter. I'm very active on social media. And I love engaging with and meeting new fans and finding out their why. Why do vampire stories matter to you?
Well, I think that is a lovely conclusion to our podcast. I'm looking forward to hanging out with you at all the endless nights.
I'm so excited.
I'm excited for Babylon Vegas. That's my big excitement, something new and exciting.
That's going to be so cool.
Top of the Mandalay Bay overlooking the Vegas Strip with a bunch of people dressed in red and black with fangs on. Can't go wrong.
Nope, I'm going to have to buy a new dress.
That's what I hear everybody's doing. Because it's funny because this is the first Endless Night event outside of the pandemic.
Yeah.
And it's a new birth.
Really special.
I'm going to ask you to think about something, but not answer the question. What do you think of the movie Byzantium? Okay. And we can talk about that private. Oh, okay. All right, I got it. So I actually saw it with Neil Jordan.
Jealous.
And it was at the Brussels International Film Festival. And it was funny because, at BIF, Brussels International Film Festival, all the actors scream, all the actors come in, and the people that watch the movie scream and throw popcorn around, and like they have to hire extra cleaning staff to make sure that the popcorn's not everywhere, because we screamed as loud. And my friend, a French girl brought me, and she was like, watch this. And she threw a whole bucket of popcorn up in the air. All right. And she's like, we can do that in this film festival. And Neil Jordan was like, what's going on with my audience? It's like
oh, no. Poor thing.
So that's something I'd like to do. I'd like to see a new record-breaking vampire movie with you in a film festival, screaming and yelling during the movie. And I asked Neil Jordan why he about his thumb claw, where he came up to it, and the vampires in that had their thumb claw as their fingernails as the tool to break the skin.
It's rooted in folklore, but we can have that conversation at another time. Because I am going to be doing a podcast episode on Byzantium. I have so much to say about it. I'm going to fill up a whole 30-minute episode.
Cool. Well, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. This was so much fun.
Yeah, we'll just continue the phone call later.
All right.
All right.